Matthew, what drew you to this project? How did you become involved with Mexican cartels and vigilante groups?
So I first heard about the story through some articles that I read. I started filming in Arizona. I was there for about 4 or 5 months, and then my father actually sent me an article about the autodefensas in Michoacan. And right when I read it, I knew I wanted to create this parallel story of vigilantism on both sides of the border.
So you started with the Arizona people. How did you get involved with the group? Why did they learn to trust you?
I think it was actually much harder to get access to the Arizona vigilantes. It took me about 4 or 5 months through a lot of phone calls and sort of pre-production to gain their trust. And then eventually, once I stepped foot down there, it was sort of, here we are, and they let me in. Whereas in Mexico, I reached out to the doctor. I got
You had read about him in articles?
I'd read a Wall Street Journal article about him, and then reached out through the journalist and got on the phone with him the next day. And he said, I told him I want to come down. I want to document your story. I want to document the story of the autodefensas. And 2 weeks later, I was down there filming. So,
tell us about your first impressions of him. He certainly seemed to be someone who loved the camera.
Yeah, he's a complex guy. And I think, one of my goals with this film was to sort of examine what drives men and women to take up arms, to take the law into their own hands. I constantly sort of wondered, what would I do if I was in that situation? What would I do if my sister was raped or my brother was hanged from a bridge? Would I take up arms? Would I fight violence with violence? Is that right? Is that just? Is vigilantism sustainable? And then, I think clearly as we see how the film plays out, we end up with a much different story than I ever could have imagined.
So as you were shooting this, you watched your own moral compass begin to change?
No. I was never an advocate for vigilantism to begin with, but I wanted to examine what provoked other people to do. I mean, I wasn't about to join the autodefensas. But it's also hard to judge unless you're in that situation. So I really wanted to go down. There've been a lot of stories about narco violence, about the drug wars, and I really, I didn't want to make a policy film. I don't want to make a film with talking heads. I want to make an experiential film in which I put myself and my crew right in the middle of the action. And when I first started, especially in Mexico, I thought it was a very simple hero-villain story of guys in white shirts fighting against guys in black shirts. And over time, that story changed. And the lines between good and evil became much more blurry.
Let's talk about time. How long were you actually down there embedded with them?
I was down there for about, in Mexico for about 9 months, 1 to 2 weeks of every month. And I actually think that's what allowed me to get into the sort of dark corners that I was able to get into. There were other people down there covering the story, but they often would go down for 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, and it's so difficult to tell that story, to tell a new story in that amount of time. And I had the fortune to be able to be there for so long, to develop relationships, to develop storylines, over a 9-month period.
Did you see those storylines begin to change in ways that you had never anticipated?
Completely. I mean, I really ended up with a much different story than I started with, and I'm not a war reporter. I've never been in situations like this before. And obviously, as you saw in the film, I found myself in, meth labs, shootouts, torture chambers, places that, were frightening. And I never sort of could dream that I'd be in those situations. But, that's where the story led me.
Can you take us into what it was like as a filmmaker to encounter these kind of dangerous situations? Were you ever fearful for your life?
I think I'd be crazy or inhuman if I didn't fear for my life. There's many frightening moments. That first shootout, was particularly frightening. Every single day we wore bulletproof vests. But that particular day it was really hot, and nothing was going on. We were at a car store. One of the autodefensa commanders was going to buy a car. And so it seemed like, you know, nothing was going on. We were basically on like a, you know, lunch break, grabbing lunch, and then boom, suddenly they get this call that Chineke and Caballo, those two assassins, were in a warehouse. We jump in the car, and then you know, suddenly we're in the middle of a shootout. And that was the first time that I ever was in a situation like that before. And I actually think that the craft of filmmaking, being behind the camera, focusing on exposure, on framing, you know, making sure the record button was on, so it helped calm me down in those situations. But I think I will say though that despite, you know, the adrenaline moments, the scariest moment for me, by far, was an interview that I did with the woman Milagros, whose husband was kidnapped by the cartel and was chopped up to pieces in front of her, and then burned to death, and to be in this room with this woman and to look at her and to sort of see these deeply hollow eyes, almost as if her soul had been sucked out of her. To hear her describe these horrors and to think that we're the same species of human beings that would do that to other people, that sort of mentally stuck with me, much more so than any of those other moments.
As the film progresses in Mexico, of course, we discover the government's involvement and the kind of fluid boundaries between the cartel and the government. Was this something from reading that you knew was down the line in a sense?
You know, I think part of what the story is what happens when government institutions fail. What happens when people live in a society where they have no one to turn to, in a lawless society. I mean, that young woman in the beginning of the film, in the scene when they kick out the army and she's screaming at the policeman, her whole family was killed by the cartel. Her parents, I think her dad was maybe like 70 years old. He was on a respirator. They kidnapped him, kidnapped her mom and her two brothers, and murdered them. And she couldn't go to the police. We were one of the first people she ever told. And to live in a society where, you know, the very institutions that are there to protect you either aren't there, or if they are there, they're in collusion with the cartel. I mean, it's a scary world, and that's where this movement was born out of. Unfortunately, you know, the movement was changed and co-opted and evolved. And
Dr. Morales is still in jail, or?
Dr. Morales is still in jail. It's almost just over a year since he's been in jail. There's been no due process, no trial. You know, his family and his supporters believe that he is in jail to silence him, and that until the government wants to hear from him, that he'll remain in jail. So, at its heart are these two men, these two very, very complex men. They're both 55 years old, El Doctor and Naylor. They both believe that the government has failed them. They've both taken the law in their own hands to fight for what they believe in. But the circumstances are quite different. You know, in Mexico, the suffering is you know, amazing, unbearable. 80,000 plus people killed since 2007. 20,000 plus people disappeared since 2007. Whereas in Arizona, obviously, that violence is not happening. It's slightly more theoretical. It's a fear that these Mexican drug wars will seep its way across our border. So, you know, obviously, they're quite different. The stories, you know, held together by a sort of distrust of the institutions to protect us, and a desire to take the law into their own hands.